Support comes from Thomas Nelson Community College, now becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College, the first choice to start a bachelor's degree since tuition is one-third the cost of four-year schools. More at tncc.edu.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, carrying out your charitable wishes forever, whether it's helping shelter animals, feeding the homeless, enhancing the arts, or supporting students. Learn more at leaveabequest.org.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Hamlee. On Wednesday afternoon, I sat down to write the script for today's show. I talked about the mass shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas, and the heartbreak we are experiencing in this awful loss of life. And then I sat down to watch the news. And once again, another mass shooting, this time in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Are we becoming numb to gun violence? How are you sorting through your feelings about what's happening? What about your kids? How are they doing? Up next on Another View, working through the trauma of gun violence. We'll be right back after this national, regional, and local news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Hamlee. Before we get into our topic today, a couple of good things to tell you about. First, we want to welcome Libby Pierce and A.B. Fivesh. They're both juniors at Norfolk Academy, and they are joining us here at WHRO, WHRV, and spending some time with us on Another View today. So welcome, ladies. We hope that you enjoy your experience with us. And I want to invite you all to tune in on Facebook this coming Sunday, June the 5th, Cooking with Jay Sennett, our wonderful Jay Sennett and Sennett in Session. He also does a cooking show on Facebook every Sunday, and he invited me and my husband, Maxie, to be his guests on Cooking with Jay, and that show will air this Sunday at 6 p.m. on WHRO's Facebook page. So if you go to facebook.com/WHRO Public Media, and you can find the show there. And Jay cooked a fabulous meal for us. It is his version of Steak Diane. And I will tell you, there's a hint, there's no steak. So there you go. But it was a lot of fun, and I hope you all will be able to go on Facebook and take a look. We really enjoyed ourselves. So let me ask you a question. How are you doing? When you send your kids to school now, do you hug them just a little bit tighter? Do you find yourself looking around more as you pull into your neighborhood grocery store? Do you wonder, could the violence experienced in Buffalo and Uvalde and Tulsa happen here? Or are you just numb to the whole thing? It's difficult to navigate through our feelings during these trying times. But here with some perspective and advice is clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at Norfolk State University, Dr. Ernestine Duncan. Hello, Dr. Duncan. How are you?
I am good. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And helping us to help our children is Dr. Mary Margaret Gleason, child and adolescent psychiatrist and vice chief of the mental health program at CHKD. How are you, Dr. Gleason?
Hey, thank you so much for including me in this important conversation.
Thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. And also joining us is Bobby Kipper, Executive Director and founder of the National Center for the Prevention of Community Violence, to talk about violence prevention methods. And in full disclosure, I am a board member of this national organization. Bobby, how are you?
Thanks, Barbara. I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with me. So I want to ask each of you, as we're getting started, how are you doing? particularly for our doctors. Well, all of you have room in this area. You have space on a professional level in what's happening in our country right now. And I just want to know how you're doing, whether or not you have to shield yourself from the anxieties that a lot of people are facing simply because of your profession. Let me start with you, Dr. Duncan.
Well, let me say first, thanks for asking. Because a lot of times it's just that people want to be heard. As for me, there are a number of things that I have noticed from the pandemic. And that is that there are so many things that we used to just kind of take for granted that we now have to give a lot of thought to. And so a coping strategy for me is to really be intentional and to regulate what I allow myself to view, what I allow myself to hear, the kind of conversations that I get in as a faculty member at Norfolk State, but I also practice. And so a lot of what I hear from people is very traumatic, the things that they are going through. And physicians, psychologists, clinicians, we can all get a secondary PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, just from hearing the stories of other people. So for me, the self-care that I need to employ, I've been more serious about it than I've ever been. And that includes physically, mentally, spiritually, paying attention to all those areas of my life and ensuring that I get what I need.
Yeah. What about you, Dr. Gleason? I would imagine, especially since you deal with children, that adds another layer.
It certainly does, and I agree with Dr. Duncan. I think that it's so important for anyone who works with families and interacts with people who in the mental health arena to be making sure we're tracking how we're doing. And so, thank you for bringing that up. I think, like so many people, I'm sad and I'm angry, and I think I'm also really motivated to make sure that we really do pay attention to the needs of children's mental health in this time of really unprecedented levels and layers of challenges that children are facing.
And Bobby, we spend lots of time, you spend all of your time trying to prevent community violence. I'm sure that this has had quite an impact upon you.
It has, Barbara. Somewhat just sorrowful, but also some frustration. As you well know, we talked about this for a long time, but it seems like it's another day, and we're back to the same script. And as you said, opening your program, and for me, it just is trying to basically really understand the facts versus the noise. And I think that's really in my work of trying to prevent violence is really knowing exactly what activity brought the violence on. And that's really, really important in the area of prevention. But it is frustrating to know that everybody's got a different opinion on the event itself, which really clouds solutions, I believe, in my world.
So, Bobby, describe for us, just so that everybody's on the same page, what constitutes a mass shooting or a mass murder?
Well, normally it's been 4 or more people. And according to the statistics, I believe there have been 12 mass shootings recorded since January this year, killing about 76 people. Actually, 31 adults and children just in Buffalo and Texas alone. So it's the number of people in one event, one large event, at the hands of at least some type of violence to be a mass shooting. Obviously, a firearm involved. You know what?
Actually, according to the Washington Post, Tulsa marks the 20th mass shooting since Uvalde in the past week. According to an article that I just pulled from the Washington Post, that this is the 20th one since Uvalde, and so that doesn't even include what happened in Buffalo. And here in Hampton Roads, we hear about a shooting almost on a day-to-day basis. And I'm wondering, as we look at this, do we pay attention to these events so much because there are so many people or is it because it was children? What is it that's triggering us now to pay even more attention than we may pay to the day-to-day information that we get about shootings right here at home?
Well, from the perspective of looking at violence as a mainstream issue in our country right now, I think it's the sensationalism, of course, a number of people in one setting, and again the instance of Buffalo, when you take a grandmother who's shopping. I mean, they're just things that these are soft targets, Barbara. I mean, they're places where you would never think in a civilized society that you could not go grocery shopping or even sit at the library of the school. So I think that's the biggest issue, and I think that's why people pay more attention to it, is because it's like you would not have believed this, I mean, in years past. But it's that targeted violence against what we determine would be softer targets and not really protected well that brings out a lot of the fear and disorientation to this problem.
Dr. Duncan, do we experience or are our reactions different to these types of acts of violence based on who is actually killed? In other words, is it because of the kids or because of the grandmothers, as Bobby just talked about? Does that make a difference in terms of how we react?
I think definitely it makes a difference. I would agree with Mr. Kipper that, we look at these people the children who have a bright future, and we never think about their lives being cut short from anything, for health reasons, but definitely not for violence. And so our hearts are just broken, knowing that all of the dreams that could be realized by parents. One of the things that's hard for me right now is just listening to the parents talk about the dreams and the hopes that they had for their children, which will now not ever be realized. And so I think it does make a difference for us, not only who is being affected in terms of the murders, but we also are being affected by who's perpetrating the murders. And so people are very angry. They're very frustrated because there do seem to be some racial, some ethnic disparities in how communities are treated and how perpetrators are treated based on those matters.
Dr. Gleason, what are the age ranges in terms of students or kids that you've talked with recently in light of these recent activities, and what are they telling you?
So I see children as young as 3 and up into adolescence. I think the younger children are focused on their day-to-day, and so they're affected in the way that the information gets transmitted to them by their parents. And so parents are noticing that these are violent events happening in everyday places, and I think that's one of the powerful things for many parents is thinking about how do they make sure that their child stays safe. For the older adolescents, it's that same sense of connection to we go to school every day. And there's a range of responses, but a lot of it focus on how the adults are responding, and are the adults making sure that that our children in our community will be safe, and that the mistakes that we're hearing about are things that our community is going to address.
So how, as an adult, as a parent or as a guardian, is there an age, Dr. Gleason, that's too young to even talk about this? Or is it kind of like the sex talk where you give them whatever their question is, you answer that question and you don't expand? Do you know what I mean?
I love the analogy. That's great. The phrase I usually use is tell the truth, but not necessarily the whole truth. So it's useful to ask kids who are out in the world, who go to school or pre-K, if they're hearing anything. So what have you heard about? What did you hear about at school? And often parents will hear nothing or today was fine. But sometimes kids will share that they're hearing about scary things or shootings. And so The amount of information should match what a parent or caregiver knows their child can understand. And so for the very young children, it is pretty simple information, but always telling the truth. And for older kids, it's answering whatever questions they have to the best of a parent's ability and saying, I don't know, when we don't know and we don't have the answer.
Is it okay to show your children your reaction? Or should you go in the corner and kind of get yourself together first and then deal with your kids?
I think that's a really important question. So in reality, we all have emotions. We all, as I mentioned before, I have emotions about what's going on. Everyone's having emotions about the news that we hear. And so it's actually really valuable for kids to know that their parents do have emotional reactions too. In terms of the processing and the venting and trying to make sense of it, it's important for adults to use other adults for processing their own uncertainties and stresses and fears. But absolutely, it's okay for children to know that their parent is sad or scared or angry, and then to model healthy strategies to deal with those feelings and you describe the coping strategies that they're using and how well they're working.
So the last question about kids, and then I'm going to ask the exact same thing on the other side to you, Dr. Duncan. And Bobby, I haven't forgotten about you. I'm coming to you soon too. Okay. But the last question for you right now, Dr. Gleason, is in terms of our children and their behaviors, are there certain things that we as parents need to watch out for or observe to see maybe if the child needs some additional help or they need to talk it out or something of that nature?
Absolutely. So we know that after unsafe or unpredictable experiences, children will show their reactions with their words, with their emotions, with their behaviors. And so we're looking for changes in any of those. And we know that humans will show some changes because there's a lot going on right now. So we're looking for children. We're looking to see that children can have some extra sadness or anger or even some difficulty with following rules that's time limited, maybe under 2 weeks, and that doesn't get in the way of their regular activities. So they can still go to school. They can still concentrate for their SOLs. They're able to follow rules, generally speaking. Children who have trouble with their functioning, who aren't able to do those their usual activities, who aren't able to function in their day-to-day life, those are children who we want to be thinking about, do they need extra help? Certainly any children or adolescents who are talking about self-harm or perseverating or thinking a lot about death or thinking about retaliation or harm to others, those are signs of potential emergencies, and we want to take those very seriously too.
Okay. 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. How are you coping with what is happening in terms of all of the gun violence that we are experiencing in our country right now? What questions do you have for our experts? 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Dr. Duncan, so how should we as adults deal with our own emotions about this? How should we be processing what we're feeling?
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate this show for is broaching the subject, whether it be because we're numb to it or we're uncomfortable with the feelings that it evokes. Often we don't have these conversations. As Dr. Gleason said, adults need to use adults to process their feelings. And so many times it's helpful for us to talk to our colleagues, to talk to our significant others, to talk to our relatives about the impact that these events are having on us. Because again, as I said at the beginning, sometimes people just need to be heard about how they're feeling. We often keep things to ourselves just because of the negative connotation that some take when I admit to feeling sad, when I admit to feeling anxious. There's a stigma attached to that. So just kind of normalizing that these are different times, that call for different measures. I think that we very openly can talk about depression and anxiety and frustration and anger when we do talk about them, but something that adults experience and we're not talking about right now is something called decision fatigue. At the top of the show, you talked about, when you take your children to school, do you hug them a little longer? Before you get out of the car at the grocery store, do you look around? Well, even before that, people are spending inordinate amounts of time making decisions about things that just used to be a part of our everyday life. So before I take my child and hug them at school, I think about whether or not I want to send them to school.
Wow.
Is today a day that I want to send them to school, or should I be practicing homeschooling? Do I really need to go to the grocery store? Do I need to go to the mall? Locally, we had an incident not very long ago where people were out for an evening of just getting pizza in Norfolk, and it resulted in death. So people are experiencing a lot of fatigue around having to put a lot of energy into the decisions that they make. And
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I was just going to add, and it's those little things, they seem little things, but they are daily, that increase our stress levels and make it difficult for us to function on a daily basis.
And let me ask you this too, Dr. Duncan. So in particularly in the Black community, because the violence is so rampant on a regular basis, does this add even more stress to the situation, especially when you see the reaction of the country, if you will, in certain communities that you don't see in others?
Definitely. I was fortunate to be invited last night to a meeting at the Kroc Center. There's going to be a Stop the Violence community forum this Saturday from 2 to 5 there.
At the Kroc Center?
Were a group at the Kroc Center.
Okay.
And there were a group of students who were invited yesterday from a local high school who are angry and frustrated. And they feel as though it's getting attention in Oklahoma. It's getting attention in Buffalo. But on an everyday basis, when they can sit there with relatives, with family members, with friends that they've lost to gun violence, and there's no conversation about that, it really brings to question for them the value of their identity to people. Do they matter? And that was an interesting perspective for me, that they really are taking from this, that there are lives that matter more than others. And while it's unfortunate that people are losing their lives, they walk away feeling as though, but no one really cares or does anything about it. It may bring us one day on the news, but that's all.
So they feel there's no follow-up, there's the resources that they need are not there after the initial event is over.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Exactly.
So what do you say? Yeah, what do you say? What do you say to them? How do you address that from a mental health perspective? I mean, what should they do as they're trying to process those feelings, but also take care of themselves?
Well, I think it's really important to put yourself in places where you can get the support. So what I said to those students last night is that whatever your experience has been to this very moment, today you're in a room with a group of people who are listening, who do care, and who want to affect some change. And so we kind of have to go to the places where we can get it. One of the things I really loved as we started the show today, you said, I want to start with a couple of good things.
Yeah.
We sometimes need to think about the good things that are happening in our lives. Yes, things are falling apart all around us, but the power of our thought is critical. And so while things around us may be falling apart, what is the one good thing? And to use that so that you don't feel completely hopeless. The power of our thoughts.
I want to ask both of you a question. I know my producer's going to yell at me because I'm going to run out of time in terms of when I'm supposed to do the reset. But my question to both of you doctors is this. And Dr. Duncan, I'm going to start with you because we know that particularly in the Black community, there's skepticism about therapy and about going to talk to someone and whether or not it works and so forth. And I'm wondering if you can set an expectation for people who may not have gone through therapy or haven't experienced it yet in terms of what they should expect out of it. Because it's not, walk in one day, tell everybody your problems, and you're done. So
that's exactly right.
But can you give us an expectation of what it is if they find that they need some additional help, what they should expect that therapy session to do for them?
Well, for me, it starts with an assumption and a realization that it is okay not to be okay. And that if we need help, that we should seek it. But once in finding a therapist, the characteristics of the therapist are less important. There's a lot of literature that looks at what are some things that might be more engaging for people in therapy. Do females need to have a female therapist? Do people of color need to have a therapist of color? And while there are some things that the similarities enhance in the therapeutic relationship, most importantly is a congruence between the person getting therapy and the therapist being able to hear and to listen to what's being said. Often in our daily conversations, we're uncomfortable with the emotion. So, there's some people who joke about the fact that you ask, how am I doing? And I might say, I'm not doing well. And the person is not really listening. They're so key to you saying, I'm good. They don't even hear that you say, I'm hurting today. And so when people express that in their usual conversations, we really don't get to a level of empathy and really hearing what somebody is saying. And so one expectation and requirement for therapy to be helpful is to find a therapist, a counselor, who makes you feel as though they truly hear and understand what you're saying. Okay. And I think once that foundation, once that basic requirement is met, there are ways that therapy can be helpful because now you have two people who are engaged in meaningful dialogue to get to the root of what it could be bothering somebody.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about managing the trauma of gun violence in light of recent events with clinical psychologist Dr. Ernestine Duncan, child and adolescent psychiatrist Dr. Mary Margaret Gleason, and Bobby Kipper, executive director and founder of the National Center for the Prevention of Community Violence. 757-440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We want you to call us and tell us how you are managing your feelings during this time. Dr. Gleason, I'm going to come to you, and then Bobby, I'm coming to you. Again, Dr. Gleason, do you see a difference in your patients of color versus your other patients in terms of expectations once they get to a place where they're coming to see you?
I think there's a big first step before I meet people where that is deciding to come to see a mental health professional and particularly a psychiatrist. And the families who I get to meet, I think, have made a decision to explore this path of support. And the goal, my hope, when patients see me, is that they experience a safe place to be heard and to expand their toolkit and their skill set. And their opportunities to be able to process emotions and organize their behaviors. I think that there are barriers that are both historical and unfortunately ongoing that we as mental health professionals need to work on to make sure that the mental health treatment experience is welcoming to children and families from all racial backgrounds. and we are absolutely working on that. I think that but I'm grateful to the families that I get to see who have overcome that first step and decided to engage in a mental health treatment approach. And I hope that they feel valued and respected, and that's the goal in any good therapeutic relationship, is that children and their families feel that they're valued, they're respected, they're heard, and that there's respectful curiosity to understand where there might be different assumptions and understandings of what mental health symptoms might mean, what the role of family is in building supports, and how to build to lean on other supports that might be available to families, faith communities being a really important part, other neighborhood and community supports as well, and teachers.
Mm-hmm. Bobby, one of the things that you work on is violence prevention and ways that schools can protect themselves. I want you all three of you, to listen to this audio clip that we have, and then we'll get your reaction on the other side.
All right, so good morning. Welcome to today's team building event. Today, we're going to be learning what to do in the event of an active shooter. We're going to bring in a special guest. She's actually an expert on this, and she's going to be leading our team building event. This is Kaylee.
If there was an active shooter, you'd all be dead. When you talk out loud, the shooter can tell where you are and where you're hiding. Sometimes we play the game who can stay quietest the longest, so we all remember. You can try and protect your friends by pushing the tables and chairs against the doors. You also have to put a piece of paper over the door window so they can't see in. And you can't cry. It gives away your position and your hiding spot. And if you're in the bathrooms, you have to stand on the toilet seat and crunch down so they can't see your feet and they can't see your head, so they don't know that you're in there.
That's crazy.
Try to listen for things that could help the police. For example, if you hear a lot of bangs like bang, 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 the shooter might be down the hall. Or if you hear louder ones like bang, 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 he could be right outside your door. If the shooter comes in the room, screaming won't do anything. You have to try and fight back. If you can't escape, we get taught the emergency window escape plan, where you have to break a window, put clothes over the frame, and climb through. Our teacher used to sing a song to make it easy to remember. Lockdown, let's all hide. Lock the doors and stay inside. Crouch on down, don't make a sound, and don't cry or you'll be found.
That was a video from March for Our Lives. The instructor for those workers was a 10-year-old. Bobby, is that the kind of training that is going on in our schools now?
Well, unfortunately, Barbara, I think there is some of that type of training going on in our schools. I'm not a real supporter of that. Obviously, I think it's a traumatized event for children, and I think that the relationship of that is that we have to be tactically approaching these situations in a very careful perspective, but at the same time, using children in the process of setting up those tactics and talking about those tactics, to me is pretty much out of bounds. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that we can do as we used to do storm drills on the inside of, the hallway, the inside of a room. There's only two things that you can do in the aspect of this. I mean, number one, you either remove a target or you reduce a target. To go to the light that I just heard is involving children, I think, too deep tactically to even understand, nor even be a part of, this type of exercise. So I'm not a real fan of it. I think it's pretty much disturbing just to hear it.
Yeah, it was pretty powerful. I tell you, just watching it. This was March for Our Lives was a group that was formed by young adults after the mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. And I know that there are school systems that provide training, active shooter training. And I don't want you to second guess what happened in Uvalde as an example, but are there certain norms, if you will, in terms of dealing with an active shooter situation, in terms of what law enforcement is taught?
Yes, Barbara, there are. And as a matter of fact, this really started to be even following Columbine, which, of course, in that particular incident, there was a lot of issues about, law enforcement standing around pretty much waiting for a specialized unit. And that's really been a problem. It's been a problem in law enforcement that for years, traditionally, we waited on specific groups to handle specific problems. But shortly after Columbine, that changed. I mean, most police departments across America started getting, training and rapid response to active shooters. There was a plan going in place for most police departments. And, unfortunately, there's certainly some questions now on this last incident. But the issue is that there is training there. It has been in place. And that was started after the Columbine incident.
So what should we do, Bobby? I mean, from a community standpoint, to try to mitigate some of this violence? Is there anything we can do?
Well, I think there's a lot that we can do. One of the things we haven't talked about that I really think we need to is why are our young people so angry at such a young age? I mean, when you look at the aspect, obviously our hearts and souls are with the victims, but I'm really concerned. As you well know, our philosophy is violence is a process. It's not an event. And there's a lot of these indicators in these people, even as young teens, that sort of stick out that should be identified. And that's what the research tells us. And unfortunately, I still think we're not quite there. We're not looking at the prevention and intervention as much as we should before the event.
Any other suggestions for people who are searching for something to do in order to keep their individual communities safe?
Yes, there's a lot that we can do. We can talk about these issues, even openly about how we can, as a community, be more aware of not only our surroundings, but the people that we are connected with. When is it okay to really, look at your child's computer over cyberbullying and those type of things? I think we have to do more community education about the grassroots issues that create these feelings in people that leads them to a pathway of violence. So open dialogue in communities about what we can do on the front end is a great place to start.
Okay, our phone lines are lit up, so let's take some calls. Joe joins us from Williamsburg. Hi, Joe, you're on the air.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Just great. Thank you. I thought readers might benefit from my experience on the morning of 9/11 because I was so traumatized after a couple hours of watching television and didn't know what to do next. And something compelled me to go outside and split and stack a cord of firewood that had arrived a few days earlier. And the next morning when I was driving into work, I had NPR on, as I always do, and there was a call-in show with a psychiatrist on board. And I happened to get on, and I told him what I had done, and he said very simply, you were restoring order to your disordered world. And that just struck me because I think what he was trying to tell me is that it was important to take some concrete action, no matter how small, that you could control, that you could be in charge, and that might lay the groundwork for then getting yourself sort of mentally reorganized and taking the next step to seek whatever help or support you might need. But I thought that was such an incisive comment, I thought I'd pass it on.
Okay, thank you so much for passing that on. Dr. Duncan, you want to respond?
I think that we all are going to experience what we experience in a different way, and therefore we're going to cope with it in different ways. And surely that was an excellent analogy to talk about ordering your world. There are some people who are responding to what's happening now by donating. There are others who are becoming socially active. And so people have to kind of identify for themselves what are the ways that are going to make the world make sense to them and make them feel as though they have some agency. And so I'm so glad that the caller found a way to restore order to his world. But we also have to understand that there are a myriad of ways that people can cope effectively and feel better about what's going on around us.
Okay. Thank you, Joe, for the call. Let's talk to Trevor in Norfolk. Hi, Trevor. You're on the air.
Hi, how you doing?
Okay.
Just to actually piggyback off of the other caller, I noticed that some people in this area have started to do that, looking for something to do to feel like they are bringing that order back. And I feel like a lot of people are also turning to purchasing a weapon and not realizing the kind of mental, like the mental strain that can place on them, and not like using it instead of actual mental services. Just wanted to know how the panelists would feel about that.
So you're saying that they go out to buy a gun as opposed as their way of putting order back into their lives?
Yeah,
Am I getting that right?
Safer because they think, they think they're going to get that and they're going to feel safer about it. And sometimes they might do it not thinking down the line of, this is something that I'm going to have to live with every day of having, a weapon in my life.
Okay. All right. Dr. Gleason, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think from the child mental health perspective, the American Academy of Pediatrics is really clear, and also our child psychiatry group, that children's mental health depends on feeling safe and protected by the people around them, and that we know, statistically speaking, that guns in the home do not help children be safe or feel safe. And so I think the kinds of things that we hope that children will have access to are those safe relationships, whether it be with their parents or their caregivers or their teachers, their pediatricians, their pastors, policymakers, that those relationships are how children will be able to feel safe and confident and maintain their mental health during stressful times. I do think that the idea of order is really important, and that we do in families, we encourage parents to maintain the routine even when the world feels a little bit topsy-turvy. And even young children can start to take action and draw signs and those kinds of things to take apart and take control back of when the world feels a little bit out of their control.
Bobby, what are your thoughts about arming yourself to protect yourself?
Well, Barbara, it's sort of a slippery slope anytime we talk about guns in America. Obviously, as you well know, one thing I've always said is that in order to find a strategy to deal with this, we've got to take the politics out of violence. And I'm staying pretty strong on that one. The other issue is that, we can't get into an argument about the right to bear arms. And that comes up all the time because it is a constitutional amendment. But as I say to people in groups when I talk to them, the right to bear arms doesn't mean it's the right person to bear an arm. There's a difference in that factor. I mean, some people feel very comfortable with having a firearm in their life, and they've raised hunting, they're raised with guns. I mean, you can't get into that argument with folks, but what you can say is that what is the purpose of you securing the weapon for? What is the intent? What are you feeling self-protected, or do you feel threatened some way of your life? I think people should do a deep dive and ask a lot of questions before they just run out. And I'm not a real fan of just, mass weapons purchases by the community because I think it sets up, some patterns of some issues. So I think it's an individual decision. Yes, they do have the right, but is it the right thing to do? That's a question we all have to ask.
Okay. Let's go to BJ in Norfolk. Hi, BJ. You're on the air.
Hey, guys. Thank you so much for taking my call. And I don't have any kids yet, but I am heartbroken over the Texas shooting and, of course, the other ones. But that Texas shooting kind of hit me different because it was middle school, like babies. And I heard somebody on NPR radio actually say, America chose guns over kids a long time ago. And that kind of hit hard. And I went to church and my pastor said, look, I'm paraphrasing. He said, get up off these pews, instead of watching the news. Do something in your corner of the world, volunteer at the jails or the churches, do something like what y'all saying, do something. And I have a glimmer of hope listening to y'all, and I thank y'all, and I'm going to keep listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the call. Dr. Duncan, any response to BJ?
I think that sometimes it's that feeling of loss of control that leads people to feel as though they've got to take matters in their own hands. And the pattern is either to do it in a way that's constructive or to do it in a way that's destructive. Earlier, Mr. Kipper mentioned we need to get to the root of why kids are so angry. The most recent mass killings that we talk about have to do with very young men. And why are they so angry? So getting to the root of what's going on with individuals that out of their desperation, they're resulting in these destructive types of behaviors. And there are lots of ideas about that. But I think we have to honestly address the role of technology and the fact that it isolates us. We really don't have the same type of family interactions, peer interactions, school interactions that we know as humans are necessary for our betterment. We need to get back to talking to each other, interacting with each other. And while technology is positive, there are also some costs that come with our human interaction. And it doesn't lend itself to us growing and being able to express ourselves in a way that sometimes is most healthy.
Yeah. Let's try to get one more call in. Brenda joins us from Gloucester. Hi, Brenda. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you. Over here in Gloucester and in Matthews, some white people are putting up Confederate flags. They're putting them up across the street from elementary school. So the kids, every day, they get off the bus, they go into school, they look across the street, there's Confederate flags. We still have Confederate monuments in our courthouses in Gloucester and in Matthews, and it's very intimidating. At a school board meeting, some of the white men came to the school board meeting, stood outside in their private property with guns, intimidating people who are trying to go into the school board meetings. Nothing that can be done, we're told, because they are on private property, which just happens to be across from where they had the school board meetings and across from elementary school. It's very, very intimidating. It's very hostile. There's a higher risk, I know, of kids with suicide. And on another note, my grandson was put on medication because of COVID and the anxiety, and now he's 13 years old. He lives in Richmond, and he's afraid to go to school. So what can we do to help these children to reduce their suicide rate and to get these people who, instead of de-escalating situations, they're escalating by their behavior, and we're told there's nothing you can do because they're on private property.
Thank you, Brenda, for the call. I appreciate that. Dr. Gleason, in terms of if your child is afraid to go to school or afraid to get involved in activities and so forth, any advice for parents to help them to deal with that?
So I think having caring adults talking about the feelings is a great step. So I'm really glad that this grandson has you. Brenda, I think beyond that, there are some online toolkits that are actually really nice, particularly for the younger kids. I would just say that Sesame Street in Communities has tremendous sets of resources for families who live in communities affected by violence, and that's a great place for people to learn relaxation skills and coping strategies, and for parents to understand that sometimes anxiety comes out as not following rules or not doing what adults want them to. So that's one great resource. I think that if someone's really struggling with doing day-to-day things like going to school, we can give them tools. We can provide reassurance that's truthful about what are we doing to, as adults, that make us feel okay about sending them to school. And then thinking about the kinds of additional resources by going to the pediatrician or mental health services to gain other tools, expand that toolkit. But the most important pieces are relationships and feeling safe, and then learning to have a feeling like anxiety and overcome it, manage it, to be able to live life in a fun and fulfilling way.
You know, Dr. Gleason, you hear people say all the time when they're talking about the warning signs after the shooting happens. Okay, and the signs that the young, especially when they're young people, that they demonstrated or that they showed, and the parent will say, well, he was a teenager and I thought he was just acting like a teenager. I mean, where is that line where you really need to be concerned and really start to push for other answers?
Sure. So one big one is not going to school. That is a sign of not being able to do what is age-appropriate activity. Another is not doing the extracurricular activities that used to be fun and enjoyable for a child, and now either they say they're not fun or the kids aren't. They're not enjoying the activity anymore. So pulling out of some of those activities or peer interactions, not doing social events. And that's harder to measure, frankly, during a pandemic because many of our social events are infection controlled. And then changes. So every child, every adolescent breaks rules sometimes. But if we see a significant change that's causing the child not to interact in the family in the way they used to, or the family having high levels of stress around the child's new patterns of behavior, those are signs that something's really different. And if it stays that way for more than 2 weeks, that's when we start to say it's worth looking at this,
taking a look at
making sure that this is something that we can provide tools, even if it's just an app that gives breathing exercises or just a handout about how to do relaxation strategies. As Dr. Duncan said, there's so many ways so many different kinds of coping strategies that can work for different people. Okay. For some people, it really is engaging in advocacy and giving them opportunities for direction. But if a family sees a child having significant changes from their usual patterns, and those significant changes get in the way of regular activities, get in the way of family life, and stick around for a couple of weeks, that's time to pay attention.
Absolutely. That is Dr. Mary Margaret Gleason. She is a adolescent and child psychiatrist with CHKD. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Gleason. We appreciate it. Dr. Duncan, you got 1 minute to give us a final word or a final piece of advice.
On an individual basis, the best thing that we can do, one is to communicate about our feelings, to know our limits, how much stress can we take, how is it affecting us, and to govern ourselves accordingly. For some, that may mean reading the news instead of watching the news. For some of us, it may mean turning the news off. Whatever it is, to know our limits. And finally, in some way, to find a means by which you can be grateful for the things that are good in your life and to consider those things.
Thank you so much. That is clinical psychologist Dr. Ernestine Duncan, and she's also professor of psychology at Norfolk State University. And Bobby Kipper, you got 30 seconds.
Thank you, Barbara. I think we got to get back to really being our brother's keeper and, actually caring within communities. I mean, schools have got to talk to parents, who've got to talk to each other, and we've got to just embrace the whole situation of really knowing what our challenges are and coming together to meet those challenges. People cannot exist in a vacuum and solve this problem. It is a sense of community that's got to grow to deal with it once and for all.
Absolutely. That is Bobby Kipper, Executive Director and founder of the National Center for the Prevention of Community Violence. And in full disclosure, I am a board member with this national organization. Thank you, Bobby, so much for joining us today. And we hope something we said resonates with you and that you will take action to protect the mental, spiritual, and emotional health of yourself and your loved ones. Feel free to share this show with a friend. Simply go to anotherviewradio.org and download the podcast. You can sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. Next week on Another View, wit and wisdom from our Another View Roundtable. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Todd Washburn is our audio engineer. And Dr. Barry Graham answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. The COVID transmission rate is now high in Hampton Roads. There's no shame in wearing your mask in public. Remember, the goal is to stay positive and test negative. Let's get together again next Thursday at noon for Another View.
Support comes from Thomas Nelson Community College, now becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College, the first choice, whether starting your bachelor's degree or advancing your career. More at tncc.edu.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, partnering with donors from all walks of life to improve southeastern Virginia through grants, scholarships, and leadership initiatives. Learn more at hamptonroadscf.org.